Something small can ruin a life. Not in a loud way. Not all at once. Sometimes it happens quietly, almost politely, like a door closing somewhere in the house when you thought everyone was still inside. Before everything fell apart, I never thought about trust. It was just there. Like oxygen. Like the floor under your feet. You don't question it because you've never had a reason to. Now I think about it all the time. People like to say things that sound comforting when they hear what happened. They lean forward, lower their voices, and tell you the same thing. It wasn't your fault. I've heard that sentence more times than I can count. Friends said it. Family said it. Even people who barely knew me said it once the story started spreading around. Apparently cheaters cheat because of something broken inside them. Apparently it has nothing to do with the person they betray. That's what everyone says. But when you're the one sitting alone afterward, that explanation doesn't really help. Because your brain doesn't stop there. Your brain starts replaying everything. Every argument. Every quiet evening where the conversation felt thinner than usual. Every moment she looked distracted while I was talking about something that mattered to me. I go through those memories like a detective now, pausing at places that felt normal at the time. Looking for signs I missed. Sometimes I'll stop in the middle of brushing my teeth because a random moment comes back to me. Something small she said. Something small I ignored. And then the comparisons start. They always do. I don't even know the guy well. I never did. But my mind fills in the gaps anyway. Was he taller? Was he funnier? Did he make her laugh more than I did? There are nights where I stand in front of the bathroom mirror longer than I should, staring at my own reflection like I'm trying to solve a puzzle. Because the strangest part of all this isn't that my marriage ended. The strangest part is what it did to my sense of who I was. I used to walk into rooms without thinking about how I looked or how I sounded. I used to speak without wondering if people secretly found me boring. I used to believe I was enough for someone. Now there's always this quiet voice in the back of my head asking a question I never used to hear. What if you weren't? The worst part about being cheated on isn't the moment you find out. It's what comes after. It's realizing that something about you changed the second the truth landed, even if nobody else can see it. You start carrying it around like a mark on your skin. Not visible. But permanent. I'm not just someone who lost a relationship. I'm someone who now understands how quickly a life you trusted can disappear. And the strange thing is, the moment that started all of this didn't feel dramatic at all. There was no shouting. No confession. No obvious clue. Just one tiny moment that felt slightly wrong. At the time, I almost ignored it. Looking back now, that was the exact moment the ground under my life started to crack. But before we get into that part, let me say something quickly. If you're someone who finds these kinds of real, messy relationship stories interesting, the kind where trust, betrayal, and hard choices collide, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. These stories aren't about drama for the sake of drama. They're about the complicated things people do to each other, and the consequences that follow. So if you're new here, take a second to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who enjoys deep storytelling. Because what happened to me didn't start with some huge scandal. It started with something so small I almost missed it. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Before all of this, my life felt normal. Not perfect. Not like the movies. Just steady. I met her during a period when things in my life were finally starting to settle down. Work was stable, my days had a rhythm, and I wasn't really looking for anything dramatic. I had already gone through the phase where every relationship felt urgent and intense. With her, it felt easier than that. We started talking the way people usually do. Small conversations at first. Nothing serious. Just the kind of exchanges that slowly stretch longer without you noticing. At some point those conversations became part of my routine. I started looking forward to them. She had a calm presence about her. Not loud, not attention-seeking. The kind of person who made you feel comfortable just sitting in the same room without needing to fill every silence. That was one of the things I liked most in the beginning. It never felt forced. When we started spending more time together, everything seemed to fall into place naturally. We shared the same kind of humor. The same relaxed pace when it came to life. Neither of us was the dramatic type. At least, that's what I believed back then. The relationship grew the way most long-term relationships do. Slowly. Quietly. First it was regular time together. Then weekends started to blend into shared plans. Eventually our lives began overlapping in ways that made it hard to imagine them being separate again. Friends met friends. Families met each other. At some point people stopped asking if we were serious and started assuming we were. I remember one night early on when someone joked that we looked too comfortable together already. I laughed at the time. But they were right. Comfort became the center of everything. Not the boring kind. The safe kind. The kind where you stop wondering if the other person is going to disappear tomorrow. When we decided to build a life together, it didn't feel like a big dramatic decision. It felt like the most obvious next step. Like continuing a sentence that had already started writing itself. For a long time, I believed we were on the same page about what loyalty meant. Neither of us talked about it much. We didn't need to. It was just understood. Or at least I thought it was. Our daily life became a collection of small routines. Morning conversations before the day started. Shared meals that turned into casual updates about work, plans, or random thoughts. Evenings spent watching something together or sitting in the same space while doing separate things. Nothing spectacular. But those quiet habits build something powerful over time. They create a feeling that your life is anchored. That someone else is moving through the world beside you. Looking back now, I realize how deeply I tied my identity to that stability. Being a good partner mattered to me. Being dependable mattered to me. I took pride in being someone who showed up, someone who stayed loyal, someone who believed that commitment meant something real. And for a long time, there was no reason to question any of it. If anything, the relationship made me feel more confident in myself. I felt like I had chosen the right person. And more importantly, that the right person had chosen me back. That feeling does something to your mind. It quiets your doubts. It makes you assume that the foundation you're standing on is solid. You stop looking for cracks because you're convinced they aren't there. And if I'm being honest, those years felt good. Peaceful. Predictable. Safe. When I think back to that version of my life now, it almost feels like remembering someone else's story. A man who walked through his days without second-guessing every memory. A man who believed the person beside him was walking in the same direction. Back then, the idea that something could quietly grow between us and someone else never even crossed my mind. Because when you trust someone completely, you don't realize how blind that trust can make you. After a while, the relationship stopped feeling new. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It just settled into something steady. The early excitement faded into routines, but the routines didn't bother me. If anything, they made things feel more real. Like we had crossed some invisible line where the relationship stopped being something temporary and started being part of everyday life. We both had our own responsibilities. Work, family things, the usual pressures that come with being adults. But we were good at supporting each other through it. If one of us had a rough day, the other would usually notice. Sometimes it was as simple as a quiet, "You okay?" while we were making dinner or sitting on the couch. Those small moments mattered more than big gestures. They made me feel like we were a team. Over time, our lives became more connected in ways that didn't feel dramatic at the time. Shared plans. Financial decisions. Talking about things months or even years ahead. We weren't just dating anymore. We were building something. And when you reach that point with someone, you stop questioning the relationship. You stop wondering if it's going to last. You start assuming it will. That assumption changes the way you think. It makes you relax. I trusted her completely. Not because I was naive, but because nothing in her behavior ever gave me a reason not to. She never seemed secretive. She never acted distant in ways that felt suspicious. If anything, she was independent in a way I respected. She had her own interests, her own friends, her own routines outside the relationship. And I never felt threatened by that. I thought that kind of independence was healthy. There were nights when we would talk about where we saw our lives going. Nothing too serious, just casual conversations about the future. Trips we might take someday. Things we wanted to improve about our lives. Those conversations created this quiet picture in my mind. A future where we kept moving forward together the way we always had. I didn't realize how deeply those assumptions were settling into my identity. Being her partner became part of how I saw myself. I was the stable one. The loyal one. The person who stayed committed even when life got complicated. And I believed she saw me the same way. When you live inside that belief long enough, it becomes automatic. You stop watching for warning signs because you're convinced there aren't any. Looking back now, I can see that relationships don't break overnight. Even the ones that end in betrayal usually spend a long time appearing completely normal. And that's the dangerous part. Because while one person is living inside the safety of that trust, the other person might already be drifting somewhere else. But at the time, none of that felt possible. If someone had asked me back then whether I trusted her, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have said yes immediately. Not because I thought she was perfect, but because I believed in what we had built together. Our life felt solid. Predictable. Reliable. And maybe that's why the first moment of doubt felt so strange when it finally appeared. It didn't come from anything dramatic. There was no argument. No obvious change in behavior. Just something small. Something that barely registered in the moment. But it left behind a strange feeling I couldn't quite explain. The kind of feeling you almost dismiss, until you realize later it was the first crack in the foundation you thought would never break. The first strange moment didn't feel like evidence. It felt more like a brief pause in the middle of something normal. One of those moments where your brain notices something slightly off, but not enough to make a big deal about it. At the time, I ignored it. We were sitting in the same room one evening. Nothing unusual about the night. She was on her phone, scrolling through something, while I was half watching something on the screen across the room. Just another quiet night. At one point her phone buzzed. That wasn't unusual either. People get messages all the time. But what caught my attention wasn't the message itself. It was the way she reacted. She picked up the phone quickly. Too quickly. And then, for a split second, she angled the screen away from me before reading it. It wasn't dramatic. If anything, it was subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. She read the message, typed something back, then set the phone down again like nothing had happened. The conversation between us kept going. But something in my mind had shifted. Not suspicion exactly. Just curiosity. Later that night, while I was brushing my teeth, the moment replayed in my head for no real reason. The way she turned the phone. The quick reply. The slight tension in her posture before she relaxed again. I remember standing there, staring at the sink, thinking how strange it was that such a tiny thing could stick in my mind like that. But I brushed it off. Everyone deserves privacy. That's what I told myself. The next few weeks went on normally. Or at least, they seemed normal on the surface. But once your brain starts paying attention to small things, it becomes hard to stop. I began noticing little changes. Nothing obvious. Just patterns that didn't quite line up with how things used to be. She spent more time on her phone than before. Not constantly, but enough that it stood out once I started paying attention. Sometimes she'd step into another room to answer a message. Other times she'd respond quickly, then flip the phone face down on the table. When I asked who she was talking to, the answers were always casual. Just a friend. Someone from work. It's nothing important. And those answers sounded reasonable. They always do. That's the tricky part about subtle changes. Each one by itself can be explained away. But over time they start stacking on top of each other. Another thing I noticed was how her attention drifted during conversations. We'd be talking about something simple, and her eyes would move toward her phone when it buzzed. She'd check it quickly. Then she'd come back to the conversation like nothing had happened. Sometimes I'd stop mid-sentence just to see if she noticed. Usually she didn't right away. And when she did, she'd smile and say something like, "Sorry, what were you saying?" The first few times, I didn't think much of it. Everyone gets distracted. But eventually I started recognizing a pattern. It felt like her mind was somewhere else, even when she was sitting right in front of me. One night I mentioned it casually. Not accusing. Just curious. "You seem busy lately," I said. She shrugged. "Just a lot going on." That was it. The conversation moved on. But the strange feeling didn't. The thing about unease is that it grows quietly. It doesn't arrive with clear proof or obvious reasons. It just sits in the background of your thoughts. At first I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself that relationships go through phases. People get stressed. People get distracted. Not every change means something bad. But once that small seed of doubt takes root, it's hard to pull it out completely. Your brain starts paying attention in ways it never did before. You notice when the phone lights up across the room. You notice when messages arrive late at night. You notice how quickly the screen disappears when you walk past. And each time, the same question flickers in your mind for just a second. Not long enough to say out loud. Just long enough to make you uncomfortable. At the time, I still believed there was a simple explanation for everything. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself trust meant giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. But there was one night when something happened that made that quiet unease feel heavier. Still not proof. Still not enough to accuse anyone of anything. Just another small moment. But that moment stayed with me in a way the others hadn't. Because for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I hadn't allowed myself to think before. And once that thought appeared, it refused to leave. The moment everything changed didn't look dramatic. No shouting. No scene. No confession. If someone had walked into the room at that exact second, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. But for me, that moment split my life into two parts. Before I knew. And after. It happened on a normal evening. One of those nights where nothing important is supposed to happen. We were both at home, moving through the usual routine. She was in another room getting ready for bed while I stayed behind for a few minutes to finish something on my laptop. Her phone was on the table nearby. That alone wasn't strange. Phones get left around all the time. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious enough yet to go searching through someone else's messages. But then the phone buzzed. The screen lit up for just a second. And my eyes moved toward it automatically. I wish I could say I looked away. I didn't. There was a short preview of the message on the screen. Just a few words before the display dimmed again. But those few words were enough. Not explicit. Not something that would shock a stranger reading it. But the tone was wrong. Too familiar. Too personal. The kind of message that didn't belong between two people who were supposed to just be casual acquaintances. For a few seconds I just sat there staring at the dark screen. My brain started doing something strange. It was trying to convince me that what I saw didn't mean what I thought it meant. Maybe it was an inside joke. Maybe I misunderstood the tone. Maybe it was old. Maybe it was nothing. That's the thing about the first moment of real suspicion. You fight it. Because the alternative is too big to accept right away. I remember picking up the phone slowly, almost like it might burn my hand if I moved too quickly. Part of me knew I shouldn't look. But another part of me felt like I had already crossed that line the second I read the message preview. The phone unlocked easily. She never hid the passcode from me. Back then, that felt like proof of trust. Now it just felt like the door had been left open. I opened the conversation attached to the message. At first, the screen filled with ordinary exchanges. Casual talk. Short updates. Things that could easily pass as harmless. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Not dramatically. Just gradually. The messages became more personal. More familiar. Little comments that suggested a level of comfort that didn't develop overnight. My chest started feeling tight while I read. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief. Because each message forced me to accept a little more of what I didn't want to understand. There were jokes that didn't make sense without a shared history. References to moments I had never heard about. And then there were the messages that didn't leave much room for interpretation at all. Not graphic. Just intimate. Too intimate. I remember staring at the screen for a long time after I finished reading. My hands felt strangely cold. The room felt quiet in a way that made every sound seem louder. Footsteps down the hallway. A cabinet closing. Normal sounds from a normal evening. Except nothing was normal anymore. Because while she was still moving through the house like everything was fine, I was sitting there realizing that a part of my life had been happening without me. And the strangest thing about that realization wasn't the anger. It was the sudden wave of questions that turned inward. Not toward her. Toward myself. Why didn't I see this earlier? How long had this been going on? What did he have that I didn't? Those questions arrived instantly, like they had been waiting just outside the door. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. Carefully. Like touching it any longer might make the situation more real than it already was. A few minutes later she walked into the room. She looked completely normal. Calm. Relaxed. She asked something simple. I don't even remember what it was now. I answered automatically. My voice sounded steady. But inside, something had already collapsed. Because in that moment, while she stood there talking to me like nothing had changed, I realized the life I believed in might not have existed the way I thought it did. After that conversation, things changed quickly. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the quiet, practical ways that happen when two people stop pretending everything is normal. The next morning felt different the moment I woke up. The house was the same. The routine should have been the same. But the understanding between us had shifted in a way that made every small interaction feel unnatural. We spoke, but carefully. Short sentences. Simple questions. Do you need the car today? I'll be home late. Conversations that avoided the one thing we both knew was sitting in the middle of the room. I noticed she tried to behave normally. Making coffee. Asking if I wanted breakfast. Mentioning things about her day the way she always had. But there was tension underneath it. Like both of us were aware that the structure holding everything together had already cracked. I spent a lot of time thinking during those first few days. Not about revenge. Not even about anger. Mostly about clarity. When trust breaks like that, your mind starts revisiting everything you believed about the relationship. Every decision. Every memory. You start asking yourself questions you never thought you'd have to ask. How long had things actually been the way they were? What parts of the relationship were real? And what parts existed only because you trusted someone who wasn't living by the same rules? I didn't demand every detail. Some people want a full timeline when something like this happens. They want every answer, every explanation. I realized pretty quickly that it wouldn't change the outcome. Knowing more wouldn't repair the part that had already broken. After a few days, I told her I couldn't continue the relationship. The conversation itself was quiet. She didn't argue the way I expected. Instead, she focused on minimizing what had happened. It didn't mean anything, she said at one point. That phrase stayed with me. Because meaning was never the issue. Trust was. She also said it had been a mistake. Something that got out of hand. Something that didn't reflect how she really felt about us. I listened. But every explanation seemed to circle around the same point without ever landing on it. Accountability. At some point she asked if we could move past it. People work through things like this, she said. Maybe some do. But sitting there, listening to the way the situation kept being described as something accidental or complicated, I realized something important. Moving past it would mean accepting a version of events that made the betrayal smaller than it actually was. And I couldn't do that. The decision to separate didn't come with a dramatic moment either. Just a quiet understanding between us that the relationship we had built no longer existed in the same form. Practical steps followed after that. Separate spaces. Conversations about logistics. Small discussions about what came next. Eventually, other people started finding out. Friends asked questions. Family members called to check in. Some people were supportive without asking for details. Others seemed uncomfortable, like they weren't sure how to react. But the reactions that surprised me the most didn't come from acquaintances. They came from the people who had once treated me like part of their family. Because when they reached out, it quickly became clear that they weren't just trying to understand what had happened. They were trying to change what I planned to do about it. The relationship didn't end in one clean moment. There wasn't a dramatic exit or some final line that closed the chapter neatly. Instead, things faded out in a slow, uncomfortable way. After that conversation, the atmosphere between us changed immediately. We still shared the same space for a little while, but it didn't feel like our space anymore. Every routine that used to feel natural now felt forced. Conversations became shorter. Silences lasted longer. There were attempts to talk about what happened. But those conversations never really went anywhere. Sometimes she would apologize again. Sometimes she would say she didn't know why things went the way they did. Other times she just looked tired, like the entire situation had worn her down too. Eventually the distance between us became too obvious to ignore. And when things finally ended, it didn't feel like a sudden loss. It felt like something that had already been slowly disappearing for weeks. What stayed with me the longest wasn't anger. It was doubt. Not about what she did. About myself. For months afterward, my mind kept going back to the same questions. Was there a moment I should have noticed sooner? Did I become boring without realizing it? Did he have something I didn't? Those thoughts would show up at random times. While driving. While trying to focus at work. Even during simple conversations with friends. People around me kept saying the same thing. This isn't about you. At first I didn't believe them. But over time, as I started looking back at the relationship with a little more distance, certain things became clearer. The secrecy. The deflection. The way my questions had been brushed aside before the truth came out. It slowly stopped feeling like I had missed something obvious. It started feeling more like I had trusted someone who made their choices quietly. And that realization didn't erase the damage. But it did shift the way I saw myself. Because maybe the real mistake I made wasn't being boring or not being enough. Maybe it was believing that loyalty works the same way for everyone. Before we move into the final part of this story, I want to ask you something. If you've ever experienced betrayal like this, or even just wondered how people end up in situations like these, take a moment to subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. These stories aren't about judging people. They're about understanding how relationships break, how trust gets tested, and what those moments reveal about us. So make sure you subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling me what you think so far. Because the part that stayed with me the longest didn't come from the confrontation. It came from what I realized much later, after everything was already over. Time creates distance. Not the kind that erases what happened. That part doesn't really go away. But enough distance that you stop replaying the same memories every single day. For a long time after everything ended, I thought the betrayal had taken something permanent from me. My confidence. My sense of identity. The version of myself that walked into life assuming loyalty meant the same thing to everyone involved. And maybe some of that did change. I don't see relationships the same way I used to. I pay attention to things now that I would have ignored before. Small shifts in tone. The way someone avoids a question. The moments when honesty feels slightly delayed. But time also showed me something I couldn't understand in the beginning. Someone else's betrayal doesn't automatically mean you were lacking something. Sometimes it just means they were capable of choices you never imagined making yourself. And that realization leaves you with a question that's harder to answer than people think. When someone decides to betray your trust, does it mean you were never enough for them? Or does it simply reveal who they really were all along?